Donna Richards is now the director of the African Heritage After School Program in Harlem and is a coordinating member of the African Heritage After School Program Initiation Society, which is presently conducting a year-long initiation process for 6 African youth. She holds a BA degree in philosophy from the University of Chicago and MA and PhD degrees in anthropology from the Graduate Faculty of the New School for Social Research. Sister Marimba is an associate professor of African Studies in the Department of Black and Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College in New York City, where she lives with a 15-year-old daughter, Jifa. I'd like to welcome Donna Richards.
Ago. 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 Going to perform libation. It's going to be very, very simple. I know you've been doing this, and this is good. It means that the ancestors are here. We want to continually make sure that they are blessing these proceedings today. The ancestors, who we call, represent our wholeness as a people, and so they must always be here for us and with us if the spirit is to be with us and if we are to be successful. I'd like you to call out names of ancestors both in your own specific genealogical line and the collective ancestors that belong to all of us as an African people. And anyone who feels moved to do so may come up, call out a name, and pour libation. Who is going to begin calling out the names of the ancestors? Delphine Douglas Richards. Douglas. Anybody else? Spirit of Nani. And Nahanda. Lyra Ingram. Yad Sansewa. And Aset. And Asar. All right, say it loud and clear. We ask that the ancestors help us in our movement towards the liberation of African people and the reconstruction of an African world order. We ask that our words and thoughts be with Ma'at, be in Ma'at, and be guided by Ma'at today. I was going to ask, and I thank very much our drummers. One of the things that I'm attempting to do is, in talking about African spirituality, is to get us to understand that that philosophy represents the totality of our being and our lives as African people, which means that we must always have the spirit and our spiritual practices be a part of everything that we do. So the drums are essential, just as the ancestors are essential. I was thinking and preparing this talk of asking that our chairs be in a circle, if that was possible. Very interesting that it is impossible because not only are they in a linear form, you see, but they've made sure that we can't move them around. So you can't change the form even if you want to. Now that's very, very interesting, you see. Should tell us something about what we have to begin doing if we really, really want to use African spirituality to guide us in everything that we do. We're going to have to move out of these places. Some radical implications. Okay, for us, spirituality is natural. African spiritual philosophy is real. It is powerful. And the irony is that we don't use it. We don't trust it. It is important that we begin by understanding the difference between African, well, I don't even like to use the word religion, but let's begin with the difference between spirituality and religion. Okay, it is essential to understand that. I hope that people are saying that more and more, and then maybe we'll come to understand it more and more. They are not the same. They are not synonymous. A religion works to sacralize a culture. Okay? All religions do that. What have been called world religions today on the material for this conference, I don't know why they're called world religions, but I assume you're talking about Christianity, Islam, Judaism. These represent the affirmation of non-African cultures. Okay? They also, in part, represent the affirmation of African oppression. They also embody anti-African beliefs and the denial of the African spirit. The various systems in Africa that we refer to sometimes as religions all share the same spiritual philosophy. So in me talking about African spirituality, I'm talking about all of us, no matter what name we use, whether it be Yoruba, or Khan, Dogon, the Fon people, and so forth. Spirituality, again, envelops the totality of our being, the totality of our life as an African people, the totality of our experience. African spiritual philosophy is really the African worldview. They are one and the same. The African worldview is a spiritual worldview. And let's look quickly at some of the principles that that philosophy and that worldview give to us. Sure that you are familiar with many of them, but we should continually remind ourselves of these principles and make them real for us. We believe, of course, in the universe as a spiritual whole in which all being is interrelated and interdependent. We believe in the organicity or the organic interrelationship of being in a cosmic universe. Interrelationship becomes extremely important in this view of the universe. The principles of reciprocity and of complementarity are basic to African spiritual philosophy. Reciprocity, the giving and receiving, and as Aikwe Armand tells us, all that lives is twin. And when we separate those two, the meaning of that is death. And it is not death as death leads to rebirth. It is final and complete and total death. It is the death of the destroyers. It is the white death. So that reciprocity for us represents the African way. And that is what African spiritual philosophy tells us. Complementarity, the relationship between the male and the female principle. The coming together of two entities in a way that makes the whole. It's the principle of complementarity, and it exists on every level of African life. It comes to us through African spiritual philosophy. For us, spirit is primary. That is extremely important. Spirit is primary. Spirit manifests itself in different ways. It takes form in matter. It gives energy to matter. Spirit gives meaning to reality in terms of African spiritual philosophy. The African worldview is holistic. And then we come to the centrality of what I have called the Mawu principle. Mawu is a term taken from the Fon people. And this principle puts emphasis on relationship, on spirituality, on wholeness, and on healing. Also, it brings us imagination and focuses on intuition, or gives a very important place to intuition in knowledge and coming to know, and in our conception of truth in African epistemology. So here we have some of the principles in the African worldview and in African spirituality. Very importantly, we have circular, non-lineal conceptions. We get the conception of sacred time, which we need to understand, and we'll talk about a bit more later. But these are some of the basic principles which need to be kept in mind. And in the little time that I have, I want to focus on some powerful concepts that come to us through African spiritual philosophy. I want to begin with the concept of the self as a cosmic being. As African people in African civilization intact, being involved in a spiritual universe, we are involved in a continual process of transformation, of self-development. And this is a process of the realization of the ever more complete and whole self. This happens through a series of initiatory stages. Life is understood as a cycle. We have a special role, a special obligation as African people to fulfill the self. And one can only do that by understanding how the personal self is the communal self, is the cosmic self, so that we move towards the more complete self through this process. At birth is the asili seed of that self, and that birth is allowed to happen by the spirit. That is, that we are allowed to take an earthly form, and we are given definition by the Egun, by the Nsamanfo, that is, by the ancestors, and by Ntu, the universal life force, Olodumare, Ama. Life cycle, then, this eternal life cycle, is a series of passages of rites of transformation, which constitute a process in which the asili seed is fulfilled. That is, the sunsum is developed. And this term, concept, sunsum, I take from the Akan people. The sunsum must be developed with guidance in a structured situation so that we become the best persons that we can be and understand ourselves as the community and as the cosmos. That we understand our relationship to the whole. Now, it's very common for us to talk about the conception of the person as the I being the we. And we say that a lot. ways of our ancestors. But those are not just words for African people. That is a living reality and a lived reality, as is our spirituality. And so the culture, through this process of rites of transformation, through this process of growth, is actually bringing that to be in our consciousness so that we do perceive ourselves as a we. There is a, where's the brother Abrafa? Is he here? Could I have this just a little bit? Let me explain what I'm doing. As we had the drums at the beginning, and any time while I am speaking that you feel called upon to play, please do that. What we need to do is to begin not only reconceptualizing the thought forms with which we work, but we need to begin restructuring the ways in which we come together and attempt to understand these concepts. As I said, the drum is essential for us when we come together as a people, just as the ancestors are. Music should be a part of everything that we do because it affects the consciousness. So how can you understand things? How can we understand concepts if we're not going to do it with those vehicles which help us to expand the consciousness? And so I'd like us to have our music with us. And it makes us feel at home. There is a saying, Umuntu, Ungumuntu, Ungabantu. I want everybody to say that with me. Umuntu. Umuntu. Don't be afraid to say it. Ungumuntu. Ungabantu. Anybody know what it means? Anybody can translate that? Somebody here should be able to. A person is not a person unless there are people. Or a person is a person through people. A person is a person because there are people. This is Zulu. This is said again and again, but more importantly, it is lived. So that to say that the I is a we in African spiritual philosophy is not just to talk. It's not just words. This is a reality. I am I because of you. You have to understand what that means deeply. The process of growth and transformation is unending in terms of African spiritual philosophy. The race develops. The African community develops. This is the continuation of the process after physical death of the person. So that the person in that way contributes to the continuum. There is a very interesting concept which I believe we've kind of slept, and that is the concept of Eshu. Eshu, which comes to us through the Yoruba system. Eshu represents the challenge of choice and the threat of fragmentation. Eshu is the constant challenge that we have as human beings to integrate the psyche. Now that is especially a challenge given our contemporary circumstances. Eshu is not the devil. Eshu is the trickster. Well, what does it mean to be a trickster? Eshu is the personification of the mysterious. Eshu confuses. What is the antidote to confusion? It is self-knowledge. So So in that act of confusing Eshu as a spirit and as a force, forces us, moves us towards knowledge of the self. Eshu represents the tension between the known and the unknown, between continuity and disruption. Eshu symbolizes the challenge of humanity. We have on the one hand inconsistency, imperfection, and ambivalence, which moves us to the search for order, the ongoing search for order. That is the human search. That is the African search. The Christian worldview simplistically reduces Eshu to the devil, accusing us then as African people of devil worship, using a concept which arises from them, from the devils themselves, actually, from their discomfort with the human, a discomfort with nature, a discomfort with the spiritual. And what I believe is that through Orisha studies, through the Vodun, through the Abason, that we will find methods of resolution, that we will find coping mechanisms, that as we describe these personalities, or really forces of nature, of Shango, Obatala, Yemanja, that we are really discussing the dynamics of the human psyche and talking about the need for transformation. And then African spiritual philosophy expresses itself in myth. Myth, which we have been told is lie. Lie, given a European definition of fact. Myth is the highest statement of truth for African people. African psychology must use African mythology to reveal the workings of the African mind. We must use African mythology to discover what is natural for us, what is healthy for us, what is sanity for us. Mythology presents to us in a systematic way the symbols which reveal African truth. And this is a multidimensional truth. In myths are given to us models for understanding the complexities of human existence, the relationship between the human and the divine. Some more concepts which come to us through African spiritual philosophy. We have the concept of Ma'at. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that concept, but it is important and it is good. It is African-centered that we are coming to know the concept of Ma'at, which, by the way, does not only exist in ancient Kemet. It importantly exists there, but it is throughout the continent of Africa. Ma'at is not only truth, justice, and righteousness, but Ma'at represents the recentering, the continual recentering of the self, coming back to the order, coming back to balance. That is a continual need. That is never achieved for all time, and now you got it, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. No, you always have to be concerned with that. So that Ma'at is a process. It is also the concept of accountability. We as African people are accountable for everything that we do. We are accountable to the whole. We are accountable to the universe, and we are accountable to the community, and therefore accountable to ourselves. That's something else we've moved away from. As we move into thought systems which are are alien to Africa. We begin thinking that it's okay to live as individuals. But as African people, we can't do that. We must be accountable for everything that we do to the whole. And it must be for the good of the whole. It must be, as my brother Malefi, Dr. Asante, tells us, it must be for the good of African people. Is it in the interest of African people? And that's what my daughter Jifa says. Always ask yourself, is it good for African people? And that's your standard. And then we have the concept of Mawu. Mawu, coming from the Fon people. Mawu represents the completion of the self, represents self-fulfillment, self-love, and wholeness. Mawu is a principle. Ma'at is a process in this interpretation. And we have Mutneta, divine motherhood. Mutneta representing the nourishment of the spirit, the power of transformation. And so Mutneta is a force, is a power, and is an energy. Another concept that comes to us through African spiritual philosophy is the concept of Nomo. We're becoming familiar also with the concept of Nomo. People are using this a lot. We need to look at the work of our artists, by the way. I think they are in touch with an aspect of African spirituality which we tend to miss, especially in academia. Nomo represents the will, represents consciousness, intent, is directed and committed action, the ability to act on the universe and in the world with intent and with purpose, with Nia. Our ancestral legacy, this African spiritual philosophy, which I'm attempting to explain, provides us with conceptions that we can use to construct an African-centered conceptual framework. It provides us with conceptions and ideas that we can use to live with and to live by. There is a very subtle, complex, interesting, and powerful concept of Ashe. And I need here really a speaker of the Yoruba language, because Ashe is actually said in several different ways, depending on where the accent is placed and has slightly different meanings. But Ashe is life force. It is inner power. It is vital energy. Ashe is also the power to bring things into existence, to actualize them, to actualize or materialize your ideas. It also represents power and authority and command. Ashe is a metaphysical phenomenon which is neither positive nor negative. It is an activating force. Ashe. Ashe. Everybody say, Ashe. Follows prayers and invocations. It is affirming. So be it. May it come to pass. Word. Ashe is also the shrine. It is the site of concentrated substances containing vital force. Herbs and foods, and sometimes the blood of animals, which can attract and stimulate into the universal life force and the power of Olodumare. Ashe is absolute power, potentially present in all things, in rocks, in hills, in streams, in mountains, in leaves, in animals, in sculpture, in the ancestors and in the spirits. By this, talking about Ashe in this way, we're able to demonstrate the complexity of African spiritual philosophy. And this can help us to understand that philosophy as a conceptual formulation. We have the concept of chi, that we get from the Igbo people, which represents our personal spirit and destiny. The concept of Nkrabya, from the Akan and the Twi language, which represents your own particular spiritual personal destiny, which functions in dialectical relationship with Nomo, the will, intent, and consciousness, so that you have that dialectical relationship between destiny and will. We have many, many conceptions of personality in Africa, theories of the psyche. There is no need for us to be talking about the id, the ego, the superego, and so forth. We have conceptions which come from the Akan people. We can talk about the Sunsum, the Okra, the Ntoro, the Moja. Among the Fon people, the Se and the Great Se, the Selido, the Joto, an aspect of the human being which comes from the ancestors. The Kapoli, again, the destiny. We have from ancient Kemet the concept of the Ka and the Ba, the Atmu, the Seb, again, which comes from the ancestors. It is the ancestral being, and many more aspects of the self. We have the Kat. The Kat is the physical body. It is a temporary vehicle for the spirit. You're only in that for a little bit of time. Yet we give so much focus. To that vehicle, when we should be focusing on something else, that which is eternal. And we have the Eleda from Yoruba, the ancestral guardian spirit, the Ori, the head. What spirit has your head? The Emi, the breath of life, and so forth. These are conceptions which, taken together, are dealing with the integration of the human being, the integration of the psyche. We have the Ren from ancient Kemet, which is the name. The name is an extremely important part of the self of the human being in the African conception. To take away the name is to begin the process of destroying the person. To rename a person is to begin the process of colonizing that person, destroying the self-concept and colonizing the mind, and that's why that's the first thing that the Europeans did, is to take away our names and to rename us and to rename our land, our valleys and our waterfalls and our rivers and so forth. Now, without rituals of transformation, rites of passage, without the process of ma'at, what happens to the African being is that we become spiritual cripples. These are the processes that we have been ignoring, have not been participating in. And this is what Aikwe Armand is referring to in 2000 Seasons when he talks about the ostentatious cripples. That is, by the neglect of the spirit, what is created are needs for material things, needs for power. What is created are distorted egos, and that's where we can use that European term, which participates then in the destruction of African civilization and moves us further away from the way. There is an author, Anyanwu, an African who speaks Yoruba, whose work I think is very important, who can help us to find our way back to the way. And I want to share some of his ideas. He says that one of the greatest achievements of African philosophy, of our spiritual philosophy, is the art of life, or the art of integration. That is, integration meaning wholeness, integration of the self and with the community. This works against alienation. One of the greatest problems in European culture for Europeans is the problem of alienation. That was not an African problem until we began denying our spirit. We have become, because we have lost this art of life, susceptible to self-destruction culturally, personally. We have become open to self-destructive behaviors. We flock to anti-African religions because we don't understand African spiritual philosophy. But those religions cannot integrate the African self. They only compartmentalize us. They succeed in the fragmentation of the African self, or in escapism, in the denial of the African spirit. Anyanwu, who among other things has written a book called The African Experience in the American Marketplace, says that African spiritual philosophy is a conceptual framework of reality that has always been integrated, enabling members of the culture to develop a strong sense of belonging to a community of shared beliefs. The African cultural process is one of discipline. I repeat that, discipline. European society at every turn tells us that we do not have to be disciplined. That is totally destructive to the African self, an undisciplined life. The whole for us is real. The sacred value is unity. In moving away from the whole, in living as individuals, that is, in trying to, we're running away from accountability. Accountability is the spiritual mandate for African people. Our conception of spirituality presents demands. It says that this ontological sense of unity must be translated into its political implications for contemporary Africans living in an anti-African society. And I think that one of the biggest problems that we have is that we are tied to the academic, to academia, which is necessarily a European conceptualization. It is based on the concept of objectification. The word object, if you look in the dictionary, you will see that the object is something which is placed in the way of the senses, something which blocks the senses. And I submit that that is the basis for the European Academy. That is the basis of the European conception of truth. It is a conception which denies the African spirit. And so if we root ourselves to academia, then what we're doing is robbing ourselves of the strength and power of our people, the strength and power that we can get from African spiritual philosophy. We've got to understand how it is possible to use African spiritual philosophy to think with as well as to organize with politically. That's the most essential point for us now. A quote from Anyanwu: "A mind that sees nothing beyond facts, or which cannot transcend facts, is a deadened mind." And I submit as well that we have been using models of the mind that represent death to the African spirit. In African spiritual philosophy, the African self emerges as a complex interaction of forces which coalesce and manifest together uniquely in the time and space of the person. The ultimate transformation being the collective form, not the personal. Self-knowledge comes from the discovery of how those forces interact. I don't believe this. Okay. And now a very important part of this discussion, the Egun, Ashe, the Nsamanfo, the ancestors. The ancestors represent for us intuitive knowledge. They are our intuitive knowledge. The ancestors are unavoidable for us as a people, that is, dealing with them, if we are to have psychological, political, spiritual wholeness. They represent our collective consciousness, our race memory. They are our connection with the source of truth and being, of spirit. They are our cultural being. They are the basis for morality among African people, for the social order through time. They represent spiritual continuity and renewal through the concept of rebirth. This concept of rebirth, I wish I had more time to talk about, is one of the most profound conceptions of African spiritual philosophy. We have used that to survive and to be creative as an African people. We do not need to borrow conceptions of either reincarnation or of an eternal life that one achieves that takes place someplace in heaven. We don't need that. We have the concept of rebirth, which is our birthright as African people. Every African person is reborn spiritually in the collective. African people never die. African spirituality is never depleted. There is no final death. We live in the collective identity of the group. There is only one way that we die as an African people, and that is when we worship someone else's ancestors. When we worship the ancestors of those who would kill us, the ancestors of the destroyers and the predators, those who would live off of us. When we deny our ancestors, we kill our ancestors, and so we kill ourselves culturally. And what kind of religion is it that demands that you deny your ancestral self? And when the ancestral spirits come and manifest themselves, that call those spirits the Holy Ghost, denying that they are African. philosophy tells us that the human being essentially is spirit, and that spiritual consciousness continues as a force, and that an important stage in our life is when we are no longer physically here, but we continue to grow spiritually. And we exist in a reciprocal relationship, an interdependent relationship with the living group. This conception of ancestor communion unites all time frames. Past, present, and future are no longer separate. The future is present in the past, and the living becomes a vehicle for joining the future and the past. Ancestor communion is a statement of African nationalism. When we pour libation, we invoke the spirits of the ancestors. We call the spirits of the ancestors. We honor them. The ancestors for us become a sanctioning force. And this concept then is culturally affirming and self-affirming. Ancestor communion is a call to war for African people. In African spiritual philosophy, time and space are more than three-dimensional. Ancestor communion, that is the Egun. In this concept, time is a continuum which influences us and which sacralizes space. Movement and change are organic, and time and space become part of a unified force field which joins us in the collective ancestral mind. And so we perceive things together as one. We can use these philosophical concepts, we can use African spiritual philosophy to make film, to tell our history and to understand our history and our life. Daughters of the Dust, which I hope most of you have seen, recreates African epistemological, ontological reality. It depicts for us and makes real a timeless dimension which is non-linear. An artist friend has said to me, because the artists really understand, that in that film, past, present, and future are all happening at once. And so what we see is an unborn child whose being is influencing the life of her antecedents before she is even physically manifested. That is a concept that comes from African spiritual philosophy. And so you see the ways in which we need to be using this philosophy. We need to talk about, and if I had more time, I would more fully, we need to talk about art, aesthetic, icon, and symbol. The way in which these are used to transform consciousness, to expand consciousness, to increase powers of perception. This is all part of African spiritual philosophy. They are used to defeat chaos, to recreate order through ritual. The mask for us is the quintessential statement of unity and matter, of unity of spirit and matter. It is a vehicle of transformation. It covers the body during ritual, or the sculpture, the piece of sculpture, which transforms space. This mask, this sculpture, is a force. It has the power to transform, the power to put us in touch with ourselves and with the forces of nature. The Sowo mask among the Mende people transforms young girls into women. The Gelede mask among the Yoruba people brings forth the power of the mothers. Masks bring the presence of the ancestors, and they can heal and frighten and make fertile and initiate and bind and oath. They can appease and atone. We escape into religions which are not of us and which are afraid of the science of spirituality, and so they don't use masks, and they destroy our sculptures. And then we justify that escape by saying that they originated in Africa. But we don't really understand what that means. We need to have more time in this discussion. We need to talk about rhythm. We need to talk about rhythm as being the essence of the universe. And we need to understand that this spiritual philosophy tells us that everything we do must bring us in touch with, in tune with the rhythm, must help us to feel the rhythm within us, which makes us one, which binds us, which makes us cosmic. You see, cosmic consciousness, which is the depth of African spiritual being, is precisely what the Europeans told us had to be destroyed if science were to begin. And that's what they say the Greeks were able to do, that they no longer had a cosmic consciousness, and so they were able to progress. You see, and we accept that. And that's what we're taught in academia. Except, of course, in the Department of African American Studies at Temple University. But that cosmic consciousness which we are afraid of, which we fight, which comes to us through our music, through our geniuses, through the drums, that is what will lead us, not only back to ourselves, but enable us to tap the strength, the power that is within African people, and which will make us understand that political activity becomes a mandate, becomes an obligation from African spirituality. Okay? One of the biggest mistakes that we have made is to trivialize spirit. What we've done is to make it as though it were just a part of our lives, something that you can just refer to at certain times, in certain ways, when you might feel like it. And that's not the case. Our ancestors told us that spirit is primary. Spirit is the essence. Spirit is totality. It is in everything that we do. It must inform everything that we do. And therefore, we cannot relegate the so-called religious life to one aspect of our existence. There cannot be contradiction, you see. We must use spirit to teach with. We must use it to develop concepts with. We must use it to fight with. If we ever did that, we would really be on our way to liberation and to reconstruction. African spiritual philosophy also helps us to understand sexuality, something which is very difficult to talk about in the European context, which we become very uncomfortable with, because in the European context, this actually concept which they created called sex, which I don't believe there's an African concept like that, represents that which is profane, in the sense that it is not sacred, that it is not spiritual. It is supposed to be just physical. It is not supposed to be cosmic. None of that is true in the African concept and understanding of sexuality. Sexuality becomes a reaffirmation of the cosmic order. The joining of male and female helps the universe to continue, not only in a physical sense, but in a metaphysical sense. Okay, it is very powerful. It is the exchange of energies. And so for us, it must always be sacred, and it must always be in the interest of the community, in the interest of the whole. And so for us, as an African people, African spiritual philosophy tells us that there are no alternative lifestyles for African people. There is only the disciplined life for African people, the cultural life for African people, and you can never talk about individual gratification. It must be always that you understand you have a sacred responsibility to keep this universe going, to keep it Africanized, and to keep the community whole. So you see that African spiritual philosophy is very demanding, and we can't equivocate on these issues. And we've got to understand that there are all kinds of ways in which every single one of us sitting here today is damaged. All of us. Because of the experience that our people have had. And that until we address that in a serious way, in a committed way, we will not be able to be healed as a people. That's what African spiritual philosophy tells us. Now, what we call, we speak of Yoruba religion, Akan religion. These are African spiritual systems. And these systems explain, generate, and sanction, and relate to forces of nature, the Orisha, the Abaso. They relate to human beings as forces of nature interacting with other forces of nature. They explain and relate to the social order human beings relating to each other. They help us to affirm the universal cosmological order through political, economic, and governmental structures. That's what these spiritual systems do. And they explain to us the uniqueness of the human mind as Muntu, expressed through will, intent, and consciousness. And so African spiritual systems really involve the organization of specialists who study these forces and then help us to relate to them better. But all of us are involved in Yoruba. All of us as African people are involved in Akan and in Fon and in Bodo. All of us. We merely have specialists which commit their lives to becoming the priest of these various systems. And that's how we have to understand them. Cannot end without raising the issue of matrifocality, mother-focusedness, if you will, in African spiritual philosophy. This is an extremely important point, and one which we have to spend more time understanding, researching, developing. There is a sister, Isi Ahmad Yume, who has written a book called African Matriarchal Foundations. She was influenced by Sheikh Anta Diop. And one of the things that she says is that there is an essential point of Diop's work, of his theory, that we have just kind of seen as being peripheral. And that is when he talks about what he calls the matriarchal nature of African civilization. That is key, she says, to understanding African civilization, and it is key also in African spiritual philosophy. And what we mean by that is that there is emphasis given to reciprocity, to wholeness, to healing, to complementarity, to balance, to harmony, spirituality itself. That is the mother principle in African spiritual philosophy. If you look at so-called world religions, I still want somebody to tell me what they are when I finish speaking. There's one thing that they all have in common. If you're talking about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, is that they all come denial of the matrifocal principle. They are all patriarchal. And so finally, we need to bring together our spiritual consciousness with a political consciousness. We need to stop making a separation between those two aspects of our existence and understand that we have chosen to be born African, that we have come from the spirit world, so we have a job to do, and that job is to avenge our ancestors. We are functioning with dissociated personalities, artificially attempting to separate our spiritual being from our intellectual being, from our cultural, political being, from our ancestral being, and from our love relationships. We join non-African religions because of the legacy of enslavement, because we're afraid. We are afraid not to be slaves. We join them because we are escaping the collective consciousness of African people. And then we try to Africanize them. We are trying to fill up holes that are within us, not understanding that in order to do that, we've got to pay a price, and it is the price of living an African-centered life. And it won't work. The holes won't be filled up. There's only one thing that you can do, and that is, it's time to come home.